Before we begin, please ensure you like and subscribe to the channel and comment with from where you are and what time you are viewing. In this way, YouTube will continue to present you with stories similar to this one. Let's get started. We intended the cruise to mark a new beginning for us. Only my 6-year-old son Noah and I are sailing away from the messy divorce that had taken up the last 18 months of our lives. This was something I had saved up for. For nearly 2 years, I was collecting extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, and saving up every dollar earned through overtime goes into a jar marked New Beginnings. We got on the ship and it was a Saturday morning in July 2018, and the humidity was high in Miami, and I recall pondering how the vessel appeared massive from the dock. 12 decks of gleaming white metal and glass with pools and restaurants and sufficient activities to amuse Noah during our week-long Caribbean escapade. The other travelers appeared like the usual cruise passengers, families with children, older couples marking anniversaries, honeymooners taking selfies by the railings. Noah was practically quaking with excitement, holding onto his small rucksack with his Nintendo DS and inquiring every 5 minutes when we would head to the water Folian. The first day was flawless, just as I had envisioned when I arranged this trip. We examined the ship from the top to the bottom. Noah's eyes widened at the rock-climbing wall, the mini golf course, the ice cream parlor that remained bis Mitternacht Jeffnet. We had dinner at the buffet, where he loaded his plate with mac and cheese and chocolate cake, and I didn't even reprimand him about vegetables since we were on vacation, damn it. And he was worthy of merely being a child after all he had seen in the course of the divorce proceedings. Later that night, after putting him into the bottom bunk in our little interior cabin, I stood in the bathroom, which was closet-sized, and gazed at my reflection. My brown hair was becoming lighter after just one day in the sun, and for the first time in ages, the bags beneath the eyes didn't appear as dark. Hope was something I actually felt. The vessel's mild, the rocking motion was calming, and the engine's hum generated white noise that allowed Noah to sleep more soundly than he had in months. I drifted off while thinking about the snorkeling trip we had planned for Grand Cayman, picturing Noah's face when it was the first time he saw tropical fish. On the second day, everything changed. It began with a minor element. While having breakfast, an announcement was made via the ship's public address system. Dear passengers, younger Sofia Martinez is kindly asked to come to the guest services on Deck 4. Sofia Martinez, para los servicios al huésped. Noah was preoccupied with soaking his pancakes in syrup as I drank my coffee, gazing at the ocean through the dining room's enormous windows. 10 minutes later, a further announcement. Christopher Johnson. Kindly report to guest services Christopher Johnson, aged 8. Dressed in a blue Captain t-shirt with America motif. I retain that detail. What reason would they have to characterize what the child had on? I thought perhaps the child was lost, and they were assisting the parents in finding them. However, 20 minutes later was called, and another name mentioned was Isabella Thompson, aged 7, last observed close to the splash zone on Deck 11. The woman at the adjacent table, traveling with her 3 children, caught my look and shrugged. "It's a busy morning for lost kids," she said with a nervous laugh. I gave a nod, but I was troubled by something. During my 12 years of experience in pediatric nursing, I cultivated a sixth sense for when matters were not as they should be regarding children. They had called 6 more names by lunchtime, children aged 5 at all times and 9, always including those particular details, what they had on, where they were seen last. But this is what got my heart racing. I never encountered any of these children reuniting with their families. I never saw a relieved parent embracing their lost child close to the guest services area. I began to pay attention, truly observing. The swimming pool, the deck was filled with families. Children dashing about, their arms marked by the drips of soft-serve ice cream from their cones. Guardians relaxing on deck chairs while covered in sunscreen. However, I started to notice other things as well. There were employees who wasn't a perfect fit. males dressed in cruise uniforms who weren't engaged in serving beverages, cleaning, or guiding activities. They were simply observing. Especially one guy, who was tall and thin and had acne scars on his cheeks, continued to walk the same path around the main pool, his eyes searching the crowd. Ertrugine, his crew badge was legitimate, but the way he moved set off every alarm in my head. Less than PPHR_output A's, Noah inquired whether he could. I went down the water slide by myself. It was only a short distance from my seat. I could hear myself say no, even although I would have permitted him under normal circumstances. But Mom, I'm not a baby, he wed. I yanked him nearer and said we would leave together in a few minutes. We spent that afternoon at the Kids Club entry on level 7 of the deck. Noah was eager to participate in the treasure hunt activity, and I thought it would be secure. It was a monitored program within a confined area with security check-in process. A man came up to us while I was completing the permission form. Evanophyllite 40, uncomplete shaven, and wearing a bright yellow shirt from the cruise line's Kids Club staff with a name tag that said Kevin, but his shirt was too new. It still bore the fold creases from the packaging, and his name tag was a bit askew. Hey, Kumpel, Sakta told Noah, while completely disregarding me at first. Are you here for the treasure hunt? To be precise, we relocated it to the arcade on 12. Deck. The prizes up there are way cooler. Do you want me to take you? Noah's face brightened up. Since we boarded, he had been pleading to go to the arcade. As he stepped closer to the man, my body, before my brain could react. I took hold of Noah's shoulder, likely with more force than needed. I replied, "We will go together," my voice sounding sharp. The man's friendly demeanor momentarily faltered, perhaps revealing a flash of irritation, anger, prior to the smile coming back. "Oh, this special event is for parents only, Verenstaltung. For insurance reasons, but I assure you he'll have a blast." The Genuine Children's Club, the supervisor, a young woman with a Brazilian accent, glanced up from her desk. Kevin is not someone I know. As well as the treasure hunt is located right here, ma'am, in our main room. The man did not run. That was what gave me the most chills. He strolled off nonchalantly as if nothing had took place. Although the supervisor contacted security, he had disappeared into the maze of corridors by the time they got there, as well as decks. Security took my statement and said they would investigate, but their tone implied that this was merely another case of a paranoid parent overreacting. Noah was unhappy that although we departed without completing the treasure hunt, I was unable to normalize my heart rate. I kept rethinking the moment, how it was remarkable how quickly Noah had been prepared to leave with this unknown man, and how the man seemed to know precisely what would attract my son. We departed after returning to our cabin. I locked the door and secured the chain, even though I realized it was likely futile. I allowed Noah to play his DS as I sat on my bunk, attempting to come to terms with what had nearly transpired. The PA system continued to broadcast announcements. Noonyaring Madison Walker, kindly go to guest services. Noah was held a little tighter by me every time. I began compiling a list on my phone, noting every name they mentioned, the times and the descriptions. When it came to dinner time, I had 14 names. 14 children whose names reverberated through the ship's speakers, yet who never appeared to manifest in any location. I hardly slept that night. Each creak of the ship, each footfall in the corridor outside caused me to sit upright in the darkness. Noah was unconscious, but I kept verifying his presence in his bunk, ensuring he was still there. At approximately 3 a.m., I heard voices in the hallway, quieted yet pressing. I leaned my ear onto the door and picked up pieces. Cozumel, port easier tomorrow. The Mexican contact, followed by footsteps moving away. I wanted to open the door and see who it was, but I couldn't risk leaving Noah. By yourself, not for a moment. For the remainder of the night, I sat on the floor between his bunk and the door, my phone in one hand and the cabin phone in the other, prepared to call security at the most minimal noise. I felt tired, but also wired on adrenaline the following morning. During breakfast, I began to engage in conversation with other parents, initially in a casual manner. "Hey, did you catch all the announcements from yesterday?" A multitude of kids adrift. The majority hadn't truly taken note. They were on holiday, beverages, kids participating in different programs. However, one mother, who is a pediatrician from Jennifer, who was named by Dallas, had noticed. She took me aside close to the omelet station. A friend of my daughter from the teen club mentioned that she saw security footage being reviewed yesterday. 3 children who were seen exiting the vessel at Nassau Port with adults who were not their parents. The personnel informed it was a custody dispute matter for her, but she looked around nervously. Those families of the kids never reported them as missing. I inquired at guest services. It felt as though the ground had suddenly disappeared beneath me. They were more than mere announcements. These were shopping lists. The PA system was being used by someone to indicate targets, possibly to communicate with accomplices. The more I reflected on it, the more it was awful but logical. International waters were characterized by unclear jurisdiction and ports, in developing nations where record-keeping may not be stringent. A vessel carrying thousands of passengers, including children, instinctively roamed away from caregivers. It was an ideal hunting ground. Jennifer and I shared contact details with each other, pledged to look after one another's kids, but I realized that wasn't sufficient. Our destination was CSML on that day. The phrases I had heard in the corridor suddenly gained a new significance. I reached a decision. We did not leave the hut. I informed Noah that I was unwell, and miracle of miracles, he didn't debate often. Perhaps he picked up on my fear. We remained shut in that small room while we ate room service, viewing films on my laptop. However, the announcements went on. Timothy Brooks, aged 6, was last spotted in a blue bathing suit near the mini golf course. Every name felt like a ticking clock to a dreadful thing. On the 4th day, the breaking point came. We had remained concealed throughout the day of the cosmic port, but Noah was becoming fidgety, weeping over not being part of the fun. In opposition to despite my better judgment, I consented to take him to the breakfast buffet early when it would be less busy. Our arrival time was 6:30 a.m. The dining room was mostly empty, save for a few elderly early risers. Noah had been, while I was eating cereal, I noticed him. He was the acne-scarred man from the pool deck, now in a server's uniform, standing by the juice station, though not in a job. He kept an eye on us. He maintained his gaze when our eyes locked. In place of that, he smiled and began to walk in the direction of our table. I got up so quickly that I toppled my coffee cup. Wir verlassen jetzt Noah. However, as I turned around, I saw another man behind us. He was younger, had a muscular build, and was dressed in a maintenance uniform. "Your son let fall this," he stated, offering a toy that didn't belong to Noah. This was a method of distraction. I immediately knew it. The scarred man was now just 3 tables away. I seized Noah's hand and more or less pulled him in the direction of the nearest exit, but then a 3rd individual showed up in the doorway, the phony Kevin from the kids' club. They coordinated and boxed us in. At that moment, I did something I regret. I yelled. Not a help for me scream, yet entirely deranged. "My kid is having a seizure," scream that caused everyone in the dining room to turn. Noah gazed at me in disbelief, yet I shoved him down and restrained his head, yelling for individuals to reach out to medical. The senior passengers hurried over, forming a crowd, and amidst the turmoil, the 3 men vanished. They were unable to capture us, even with 20 witnesses around. Medical from ship showed up with a wheelchair, and I continued the charade by claiming Noah had childhood epilepsy and that I worked as a nurse, that we had to reach the medical center at once. When we were in the medical bay with real security present, I succumbed and revealed everything to them. The physician, a senior British woman by the name of Dr. Whitmore, heard my story as he checked Noah. She and the security chief exchanged glances, then stated quietly, "You're not the first parent to mention this. We have had 3 families disembark from the cruise at earlier ports after comparable occurrences." She accessed something on her computer and then turned the screen away from us. "I will propose that the passenger disembark immediately for medical reasons. This afternoon, a flight departs from Cozumel to Miami. You will be escorted by security to pack and disembark the ship. Ira Augen were absolutely serious. Make no stops anywhere. Refrain from talking to anyone. Simply pack your things and leave. 2 security personnel escorted us to our cabin. Genuine security, with radios and serious looks, not similar to the dismissive ones mentioned previously. As I packed our things into suitcases, one of them was positioned in our room, whereas the other kept watch over the corridor. Noah continued to inquire about what was going on, why we were departing, and I was obliged to tell a falsehood. Mommy's health is really bad, sweetheart. We have to head home. I shook my hands as I fastened the bag shut while recalling the names of all those children announced over the speakers. How many had really managed to get there home? The security personnel escorted us via a service elevator I was unaware of, through hallways that travelers do not ever see. Unadorned metal walls, visible piping, the underside of the city that floats. We came out at a crew exit on deck 2, where a van was already awaiting. As we were just about to enter the van, "Ma'am," he murmured, "erase any pictures from the ship. Refrain from sharing anything about this on the internet. These individuals have links in every place. Simply go back home and put this out of your mind." Cruise occurred. His fear was so real that it weakened my knees. Throughout, during the trip to the airport, I held Noah so tightly that he complained of not being able to breathe. However, I could not let go. I continued to think regarding that phony Kevin, how he had known precisely what my son wanted, how ready they were all. That night, we arrived back home in Ohio. Our cruise line issued a refund for the whole journey without me asking at all, which indicated everything I required about their desire for this interred. For weeks afterwards, I experienced nightmares concerning those announcements, regarding children's names reverberating through speakers as their parents searched desperately. I contacted the FBI and submitted a report. However, the agent who received the statement appeared unbothered, even fatigued. He mentioned international waters like that clarified everything. "We are aware of the situation. Thank you for your documentation." That was all. No follow-up, no investigation that I'm aware of. The pediatrician from Dallas, Jennifer, sent me a text once to say they had also made it home safely. Dan wore your number not connected. I never learned what became of the children whose names were called. Occasionally I look them up on Google. Missing, Sophia Martinez. Though Christopher Johnson vanished, nothing ever arises, as if they had never existed. Noah has little recollection of the now cruise. Thank heavens. He simply knows we returned home early due to Mom falling ill. However, I recall it all. The manner in which those men navigated the ship as if they were entitled to be there. The informal effectiveness of their pursuit of game. The flawless disguise for thousands of tourists who aren't paying attention. Occasionally, when I find myself in a packed shopping center or amusement park and hear a child's name announced on the loudspeaker, my entire body freezes, and I find myself surveying the throng for males who are observing with excessive scrutiny, grinning too broadly, and donning uniforms that lack in good shape. That September, the Atlantic was bumpier than normal, and most passengers had already gone back to their cabins by the moment everything went awry. After spending 3 days on the ship, one of those medium-sized vessels that operate in New York to Southampton way. Not glamorous, but reasonably comfortable. My cabin was located on the 7th floor, merely a small room with a porthole that remained fogged due to the temperature difference between the air from the ocean and the heating system of the ship. Following 8 years with Boston PD, and after 2 years of running my own security consulting firm, I had become quite adept at reading people and spotting patterns that was out of place. After my divorce papers came through, my sister had practically forced this trip on me. Told me a week on the water would help me reset. Quit your fixation on threat assessments and surveillance footage for corporate clients who overspent for tranquility. She was right. In the initial days, there was precisely the type of unthinking downtime I required. Subpar food at the buffet, a comedy performance that caused me to laugh just one time, and spend long hours on the deck watching the horizon rise and fall. All changed on night 3 at approximately 11:30 in the primary lounge. I had taken a seat at the bar, sipping bourbon and observing the bartender, a young Romanian named Anton, who must have been younger than 25, manage drink requests from passengers who were getting more and more intoxicated. At that point, the shouting began close to the casino entrance. 2 men in their 40s, wearing pricey clothes but putting it on incorrectly, as if they had purchased it especially for this journey. The larger individual had shoulders that extended beyond his navy blue blazer to its limits, and when he pushed the smaller guy, it was more than just anger. It was theatrical and calculated awe. The smaller man collided with a table where 4 women were playing cards, scattering chips and drinks everywhere you look. Then, I spotted something that activated every instinct from my police days. 3 other men dispersed. Everyone in the lounge rose to their feet at the precise same moment. They neither hurried to assist nor stared in astonishment like the others. Else, they advanced purposefully, coming together at the scene as if it had been rehearsed. In the following minute, the situation turned the lounge into utter disarray. As all were concentrating on the altercation involving the 2 men, the other 3 who had stood up drew knives. Not pocket knives or kitchen knives, but blades made of ceramic, the type that won't trigger metal detectors. A wiry guy with a shaved head, one of them head and a scar extending from his left ear to his jaw, headed directly for the handbags and jewelry of the women playing cards had been left on their table. Another person went to the bar's rear, where Anton was rooted to the spot, and the third took his place at the principal exit. The large man who had initiated the brawl suddenly possessed a knife as well, while rummaging through his pockets. At that moment, I understood the smaller man was not a coincidence. Trug eine Pek Filippo Uhr IM-Wert von mindestens 40.000 Euro, und sein Earring had a diamond that reflected the light like a disco ball. The assailants had previously identified him and likely observed his victories, making big bets at the casino or showing off cash at dinner. No one was screaming yet. It occurred too quickly for anyone to comprehend what they were witnessing. I had left my issued firearm at home. Clearly, weapons are not allowed on cruise ships. However, I still had my tactical pen clipped to my pocket as a habit from work. In the absence of after considering it, which was likely foolish, I got to my feet and advanced toward the man who was threatening Anton. He possessed with a tip jar for the bartender in one hand and his blade in the other, sweeping it back and forward to maintain Anton's position against the wall of bottles. I took a heavy glass ashtray from the bar. They retained them, although it was not permitted to smoke indoors, and slammed it onto the assailant's wrist. The split could be heard even amid the escalating panic in the room. His knife rattled on the floor, and Anton, bless him, acted without hesitation. He seized a vodka bottle and broke it on the man's head, causing him to drop immediately. But at that time, I created an error. I stooped to pick up the ceramic knife, and when I rose again, the one with scars was already advancing in my direction. His blade was held low and with professionalism, like someone experienced in this. The lounge had now erupted into complete chaos, with passengers rushing for exits and tables flipping over, glass shattering all over the place. The man with scars advanced toward me using a boxer's footwork, throwing quick jabs with the blade that propelled me back toward the windows with a view of the dark sea. Twice I succeeded in fending off with the knife I had picked up, but this guy was skilled. He feinted, then slashed, left correct, seizing my forearm and creating a wound that instantly drenched my sleeve with blood. The discomfort was acute and burning, but the adrenaline kept me going. I could see the large man pulling the wealthy customer toward a service behind him door, continuing to apply the knife to his neck as his accomplice filled a cloth bag with wallets and jewelry. They existed operating quickly and systematically, as if they had performed this precise task previously. I booted a chair into the path of the scarred man, giving myself 2 seconds to seize a champagne bottle from a discarded tableau. As he approached me once more, I swung it like a baseball bat, hitting his shoulder and causing him to spin to the side, within the piano. At that point, ship security finally arrived. Two officers in white uniforms who appeared as if they had never encountered anything more serious than a drunken passenger slipping into the pool. They carried batons but no firearms, and they paused at the entrance, attempting to comprehend the situation. The assailants showed no hesitation whatsoever. The one at the exit let out a sharp, loud whistle like calling a dog, and in an instant they were all on the move, leaving their victims and plunder, making for various exits with rehearsed effectiveness. The one with scars moved away from the piano while holding his shoulder, but still able to move, and vanished through a door labeled crew only. The big guy pushed his hostage to the ground and disappeared through the service entrance he had been going toward in the direction of. In the span of 15 seconds, they disappeared, leaving a lounge that seemed as though a hurricane had struck it. Passengers cowered behind, shattered glass all around, and blood on the carpet, upturned furniture, and me standing there with a cut arm and a bloody champagne bottle, attempting to clarify to assurance that this wasn't merely a bar fight that escalated. The medical center of the ship was located on deck 3, and the physician, a woman from Hungary named Dr. Kovacs, whose hair is gray, pulled back in while I attempted to persuade the head of security that we were facing a serious issue. A severe bun stitched my arm. Hauptmann Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, still buttoning his uniform jacket, and finally appeared to be someone competent. I presented it to him. The ceramic weapons, the synchronized actions, the crew-only exit paths, the fact that they had aimed at particular affluent passengers. They were neither opportunistic thieves nor drunken troublemakers. They had examined the arrangement of the ship, recognized indicators, and devised their escape routes. The captain's complexion drained of color when I referred to the ceramic knives. He said quietly, more to himself than to me, "Those don't show up on our scanners." "Doctor," as I recounted their movements through the lounge, Kovacs halted his stitching for a moment, every man knowing precisely where to head. "What was the number of passengers who boarded in New York?" I made an inquiry. Morrison took out a tablet, he said, scrolled through some files. 837. However, we do not take photographs, travelers, solely verify passports with the manifest. I managed to persuade Morrison to retrieve the security footage from the day of embarkation. We then spent 3 hours in a cramped office behind the bridge, observing low-quality footage on screens that appeared to be from the vowed 90s and hadn't been updated since then. Anton, who had offered assistance after finishing his shift, and it became clear he had a photographer's eye for faces, were the first to spot them. 5 men who had boarded individually but within the same 30-minute time frame, each carrying comparable black duffel bags, all moving with that same measured stride I had observed in the lounge. They had dispersed directly after boarding. No mutual recognition, yet the timing was too perfect to be chance occurrence. We monitored their movements using the ship's cameras for the following 48 hours. They consumed food at various restaurants, utilized different pools, and never showed up together in public. But Anton noticed something I'd overlooked. All of them had cabins on deck 2, which consisted of the least expensive interior rooms, all located in the identical corridor. Who arranges 5 individual interior cabins for a transatlantic voyage? Auf Antons Frage hin, und genau dann it made sense. I requested Morrison to verify the booking records. The 5 reservations had all been made on the same day from 6 weeks ago. All settled with prepaid credit cards, all utilizing different travel agencies, albeit with sequentially arranged booking reference numbers. Morrison wished to search their cabins right away, but I halted IHN. I said they know we've caught on to them now. If we frighten them, they could take some drastic measures. We find ourselves in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No escape, but that also means no place for passengers to flee to either. As an alternative, I propose that we keep an eye on them and determine what they will do next. The captain consented and assigned his 2 best security officers to lurk in the corridors close to their cabins. However, these individuals were clever. In the interest of, for the following 18 hours, they all stayed in their rooms. Keine Zimmerservice-Bestellungen, keine toilet breaks that we could notice, nada. It was as if they had disappeared into those cabins. Then Anton, who had took it upon himself to review the dining records and discovered something intriguing. During the last 2 days, Someone had placed orders for enormous quantities of food from the midnight buffet, sufficient for 15 people, and charging it to a cabin of the Andersons, an elderly couple from Vermont who had been eating in the main every night in the dining room. Upon reviewing the security footage from the buffet, we observed one of our suspects, the big guy, from the brawl, stacking several plates at 2 a.m. and then vanishing toward the service elevator. When Morrison retrieved the ship's blueprints, the pieces began to fit together. The freight elevator from the buffet zone linked to a service passageway that extended along Deck 2, directly behind the line of cabins where our 5 suspects were located. But this is what sent a chill down my spine. The same hallway provided direct access to the ship's storage hold, where valuables belonging to passengers were secured in safety deposit boxes. The cruise line promoted it as a reliable service for those traveling with valuable jewelry or significant sums of money. When Morrison understood what I was implying, his face turned pale. Inside, there are likely items valued at $3 million. That hold, he murmured. The assault in the lounge was not the true offense, and a trial to gauge security's reaction and the duration of it would require what type of opposition they would encounter. They had plans for something far larger, and it's already the 4th day of a 7-day crossing. The next port of call was Southampton, but we made a short stop in the Azores within 36 hours for refueling. Carry it out just prior to reaching the Azores, vanish into the Portuguese islands before anyone noticed the occurrence. Us had under 36 hours to prevent them. Und Morrison sprach bereits davon, die Küstenwache zu benachrichtigen und eine Armed Forces Escort, all the bureaucratic processes that would consume too much time and likely notify our suspects that we were onto them. I suggested an alternative. I said to let them think they're invisible. However, we laid a trap. The plan involved risks, but was straightforward. That night, we would relocate all the actual valuables from the storage hold and substitute them with imitation jewelry and vacant boxes, then bide your time for them to act. Morrison showed reluctance. Just the liability issues could bring his career to an end. He was aware, however, our options were limited. On that evening, as the majority of passengers attended the captain's formal dinner, Morrison, along with Anton and 2 trusted security officers, I emptied the storage hold quietly. We placed all items into the captain's personal safe and 3 secured crew lockers, taking photographs of each item for purposes of insurance. Anton had a cousin employed at the ship's theater, and we borrowed costume jewelry that was spray-painted rocks, were made to resemble gold bars, and some boxes were even packed with poker chips from the casino. At 4 a.m., the storage hold appeared identical, but held nothing of greater value than a few hundred. The worst part was the waiting. 28 hours went by without any movement from their cabins. I began to have doubts about myself, curious if I had perhaps misunderstood the entire situation. Then, precisely at 3:15 a.m. on our last night before reaching the Azores, the ship's fire alarm was triggered in the kitchen. An oil fire that necessitated all crew on hand to reply, except that I had been monitoring the kitchen cameras, and no fire occurred. The alarm had been triggered manually by someone. Morrison and I remained concealed in a maintenance closet located close to the storage hold while chaos broke out above us. We heard footsteps through the vent in the door, several sets, progressing quickly yet silently. They possessed a key card that was not supposed to have were there, unfastening the hold as if they were in charge of the location. We held off until all 5 had entered. Morrison then struck the emergency lockdown he had set up beforehand. The magnetic locks clicked into place with a solid sound, sealing them inside with their unworthy haul. As security opened the door 20 minutes later, the 5 men were standing amidst a collection of costume jewelry and spray-painted rocks, their canvas bags partially filled with imitation gold bars. The one with scars laughed upon understanding what had transpired, shaking his head as if he valued the performance. When we arrived in the Azores after 6 hours, Portuguese police were waiting for us, and the FBI met us in Southampton with a warrant covering all crew members. It turns out these individuals were involved in a Romanian criminal organization that had targeted 3 other cruises lines over the last 2 years. always using the same technique, tired of fake identities, generate a diversion, and then remove the ship's valuables before disappearing at port. The agent of the FBI informed me they had stolen a total of more than $12 million, consistently choosing transatlantic routes with less security, and travelers had more cash and jewelry on them. The ceramic knives were tailor-made in Prague, designed in particular to circumvent ship security. The revelation of the internal assistance was what truly shocked me. A team member in reservations had been supplying them with details about affluent passengers and cabin assignments for a portion of the gains. The day after we docked, they apprehended him while he was attempting to board a flight to Bucharest. I received a job offer from Morrison as the cruise line's new security chief position, but I declined it. The ocean is lovely and all, but I'll remain in areas where criminals can't imprison you in a metal box for 7 days. Anton ultimately provided testimony at the trial and utilized the prize money to establish his own bar in Boston. Herminante as the ceramic knife, which I mentioned was awful marketing, but he was indifferent. Occasionally, I drop in for a drink, and we chat about that evening and how near those guys were to executing the flawless Robuberfall. My arm healed well, leaving only a thin white scar that aches when it rainfall. Now, whenever I come across a cruise ship ad, I find myself questioning how many individuals understand they're essentially offering to be shut in a buoyant metropolis with people one has never met before, with the hope that all are precisely who they say they are. It was the afternoon, and the sun blazed down on the pool deck when everything changed. At that time, I was managing a hardware store at the age of 38 in Phoenix, and we had spent 2 years saving up to go on this cruise. My wife Lisa and I, our daughter Madison, who is a teenager, along with my father Walter. Hat gerade das Rentenalter erreicht und ist in den Ruhestand gegangen. The Athalder, from his position at the Postal Service after 40 years. The man never went on holiday. He always said he would travel after retiring. Thus, we organized this trip as a birthday surprise for him. We found ourselves at a point that was somewhere between Florida as well as Jamaica. It's the second day at sea on a 7-day cruise that was meant to be the trip of a lifetime. Vader wore for once having fun and chuckling at Madison's efforts to show him how to play shuffleboard. The features of his face sunburned despite Lisa's constant application of SPF 50 on him. I recall the exact moment as Madison had just scored her first point and was performing this silly victory dance when Dad's the stick used for shuffleboard clattered onto the deck. His right hand was gripping his chest, with his fingers sinking into his Hawaiian shirt, the absurd one featuring parrots that Madison had purchased for him specifically for this trip. The features of his face changed from a sunburned red to this terrible grayish hue in seconds. Versuchte to try to say something, but all that escaped him was this strangled gasp before his knees gave way. I intercepted him prior to his hitting the deck, and his weight almost brought me down along with him. His eyes were open wide, filled with terror, and he kept clutching at his chest as if he were trying to rip something out. Lisa began to scream for help while Madison remained motionless, her shuffleboard stick still in her grasp, as if she were unable to comprehend the situation. A crew member in a white uniform showed up in about 30 seconds, it felt like hours, and instantly summoned medical assistance via his radio. Though they brought a wheelchair, Dad wasn't able to sit up properly. He continued to slump forward, his breathing producing awful wheezes. Us ultimately ended up carrying him, with me supporting him from above, while a crew member held his legs as Lisa sprinted forward to clear the way amidst the throngs of sunbathers, all of whom were now gazing. The medical center was located on Deck 2, hidden behind the photo gallery attempting to sell you pictures of yourself boarding the ship at inflated prices. First, it was the smell that hit me. 9, the antiseptic scent, typical of hospitals, but rather this odd blend of mildew and air freshener, as if they were attempting to conceal something. The waiting area contained 3 plastic chairs and a water cooler, which was devoid of water, only the blue one bottle left there gathering dust. The doctor, although I'm still uncertain whether he was genuinely a doctor, introduced himself in the role of Dr. Petrov, who spoke with a heavy accent from Eastern Europe. Wore perhaps 28, 30 at the most, with acne scars on his cheeks and medical scrubs that seemed as if they had undergone too many washes, with a faded appearance and thinness. The caregiver he had a woman named Carla from the Philippines, who at least appeared to know what she was doing. She got Dad onto the examination table that was essentially a padded bench affixed to the wall and began assessing his vitals. Mediciner Petro used a stethoscope that seemed to predate me by several years to listen to Dad's chest. He then faced us with this look that caused my stomach to clench. Could it be a likely cardiac event? He spoke as if he were informing us that Father was suffering from a cold. We provide aspirin monitor. The next port might be 10, 12H. He is sufficiently stable. Dad, however, didn't seem stable. The corners of his mouth bore this bluish tinge. He kept grasping his chest as tears streamed down his face from the pain. Lisa then lost it, and in our 16 years of marriage, I had never seen my wife like that before. She seized Dr. Petrov in his faded scrubs, actually seized him, and began yelling about helicopters, about contacting the Coast Guard, about taking genuine action rather than merely observing the death of her father-in-law. The doctor merely stood there, blinking quickly, while Carla carefully removed Lisa's hands. Carla said quietly, "Ma'am, please understand." Although her voice was steady, her eyes revealed that she understood precisely how serious this was. Die Kosten für die Hubschrauber-Evakuierung betragen mindestens 50,000 United States dollars. Insurance typically does not cover this, and we need to get approval from the corporate office first. It can take 4 or 5 hours just for the paperwork. She pointed at the cabinet with medical supplies. Then, they assured us they had equipment, but it was pathetic. Some adhesive dressings, fundamental medications and containers with labels so worn that they were hardly legible. A tank of oxygen that appeared to be part of within a museum, and an electrocardiogram machine with a broken screen secured with medical tape. Dad began to vomit. Then, this brutal convulsing that made him shout in agony with every spasm. Dr. Wah. Petrov appeared to be truly taken aback, as if this wasn't covered in whatever manual he'd committed to memory. While fumbling with the oxygen tank in an attempt to fit the mask onto Dad's face, he struggled as the elastic strap snapped. Instant, he extended it. While Carla looked for tape, he had to hold it by hand. I inquired about nitroglycerin, regarding clot-busting medications, regarding anything I had learned from health programs. Juan Petro simply shook his head. We don't carry items like that. They're too costly and have a short shelf life. Company policy. At that moment, I saw the defibrillator in the corner. It was dusty and had a note stuck to it that said, "Not functional, waiting for components." In the corner, Madison was crying uncontrollably. Crying out for her granddad, as Dad's breaths became increasingly difficult, each one resembling a struggle against drowning in the lungs of his own body. The next 3 hours felt like the longest of my life. We alternated keeping that oxygen mask on Dad's face, since there was just a single roll of medical tape available and it wasn't sufficient to support the weight. Because the heart monitor's battery was dead, Carla continued to check his pulse manually, and the replacement was requested from corporate. Dr. Petrov vanished for an hour, and on his return he had a cigarette smell about him and avoided eye contact. At about the second hour, Dad began having what Carla called episodes in a quiet manner. His entire body would stiffen, eyes turning upward, which may last 20 to 30 seconds each time. After the third one, even Petro appeared frightened. He ultimately acknowledged that his experience working on cruise ships spanned just 3 months, and that he had been a general practitioner in Romania for only 2 years prior to this, primarily addressing colds and stomach bugs. The cruise line had employed him since his fee was only a third of that demanded by American doctors. The talk with the will forever remain in my memory. Cruise director arrived after about 4 hours. Gregory, or whatever. This one guy in his 40s with a spray tan and veneers that are painfully white to behold. Dressing in a uniform adorned with greater quantities of imitation gold than a store for costumes. Kam herein, während Papa gerade einen EP oder EPI Episode hatte und wartete, bis sie vorbei war, as if it were merely a hassle before starting on a pre-prepared talk about liability and international shipping law. Als ihr Vater einbordete, unterzeichnete einen Verzicht, sagte taking out his phone to display the terms and conditions that no one ever reads. In Section 47B, it is stated explicitly that medical facilities are limited and guests travel at their own risk. As Lisa began while crying more intensely, he presented us with a 20% discount on our next cruise and complimentary drink packages for the remainder of this journey. I wanted to toss him through the porthole, but I couldn't leave my father's side. His skin had changed from gray to nearly transparent, through which the veins in his temples were visible, their rhythm erratic. At times, they were hardly moving at all. At hour 6, other passengers began to assemble outside the health center. The news had spread throughout the ship, and individuals were filming with their phones through the little window in the door. A woman from Kansas City actually knocked and asked us to keep it down because they attempted to relish the comedy performance next door. At that moment, I lost it. I burst out into the hallway and said everyone precisely what was going on, the method of the defibrillators breaking, how they wouldn't demand evacuation, how the physician acknowledged he lacked qualifications for everything. Individuals began sharing it on social media right away. Gregory returned within an hour, this time with the captain, a Norwegian man named Eriksson, who showed some decency by appearing uncomfortable. They proposed to make a call for evacuation at this time, but only if we signed documents that absolved the cruise line of any responsibility and agreed to cover costs, all expenses paid in advance. They had a credit card machine right at that spot, prepared to bill us for the $50,000 deposit. It was Madison who came up with the idea of calling the information. As Lisa and I debated with the captain regarding the evacuation, she utilized the ship's Wi-Fi at a rate of $15 for 30 minutes, as even in an emergency they were nickel and diming us, to send emails to every news station she could locate. She dispatched those videos of the damaged tools, audio of Gregory's talk on liability, images of the out-of-order defibrillator. In fact, CNN returned the call within 20 minutes, and all of a sudden Captain Eriksson's the phone began to ring incessantly. The corporate office of the cruise line was in a state of full-blown panic. The evacuating by helicopter, but at that point we had already spent 7.5 hours in that moldy medical center. Dad had ceased to have episodes, which, Carla mentioned, wasn't necessarily a good sign. His responses were minimal. His pulse was so weak that she had to check it at his neck, as she could no longer locate it at his wrist. The helicopter got there at hour 9, and Dad's ascent to the landing pad was a nightmare that continues to haunt my dreams. The ship had an elevator to the upper deck that was being serviced, which meant that 6 crew members were required to transport him on a stretcher up 4 flights of stairs, along with duct tape in one corner. One of the handles broke in the middle, and this child, who was unable to since turning 19, had to carry the burden of his father. On the top deck, the wind was fierce, the chopper hovering but unable to touch down since the cruise ship's landing pad had not been certified for 3 years. A further expense reduction measure. A rescue basket had to be lowered, and seeing them load my father, who was unconscious, into it, his body, the most frightening experience I've ever had, was hanging 30 feet above the deck in a swaying basket, limping like a rag doll observed. Lisa was unable to watch while Madison recorded everything. Spader Erzalen. She did it to have proof in case something went awry. Dad survived, but just barely. The physicians at the hospital in Fort Lauderdale stated that another hour would have meant he was gone. Hatte einen Herzinfarkt großen Ausmaßes erlitten, und das Fehlen of adequate treatment for those 9 hours had resulted in further damage. His heart was functioning at only 30%. He was in the ICU for 3 weeks, underwent triple bypass surgery, and now 2 years he still can't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to rest later. The medical expenses reached $400,000, and the cruise line contested every cent, asserting that we had declined their initial treatment strategy and caused the delay ourselves by bringing the media into it. We are still involved in litigation, but at least Dad is living. The cruise line never acknowledged any fault, opting instead for a quiet settlement with CNN's story containing a declaration regarding the review of their medical preparedness protocols. Dr. Petrov is still employed by them, but on a different ship. I know, as Madison discovered him on social media, sharing photos from the crew deck and smiling as if nothing had occurred. They have repaired the defibrillator, however. It was included in their press release regarding their dedication to passenger safety. At 22 years of age, I had never been on anything larger than my uncle's fishing boat in Colorado. Yet there I was, while 4,000 other passengers are standing on deck 7 of this massive ship, watching the Mexican coastline fade into darkness celebrated in my vicinity. For 2 years I worked double shifts at a greasy diner in Denver as a waiter to save money. Weekend, convincing myself that it would all pay off once I finally boarded that ship. Ashley, my roommate, believed I was insane to go solo. She kept saying I should wait until she had saved up and we could go together. This trip was necessary for me. I needed to show myself that I was capable of achieving something significant independently. The initial 2 days had been unbelievable. Snorkeling during our port stop, connecting with other solo travelers at the poolside mixers, indulging in more shrimp at the buffet than most people should, probably. On the third night, I made up my mind to go all out at the steakhouse, the one where you needed a reservation and had to pay an additional $70 just to enter the door. The dining area featured floor-to-ceiling windows with ocean views, tables lit by candles with real cloth napkins, along with waitstaff who recalled your name after just one mention. The guy serving me, Dominic with a strong Italian accent, suggested the ribeye with herb butter, claiming it was the finest cut they had received in weeks. I'm not going to lie, but when that plate arrived, I took about 5 photos before even picking up my fork. The beefsteak was as thick as a dictionary, blackened at the edges but oozing pink within, immersed in this green butter that had garlic and rosemary pieces. The initial bite tasted slightly metallic. It was somewhat sharp on my tongue, but Dominic assured me that was merely due to the dry aging process, some aspects of enzymes decomposing the proteins. The pair beside me, the Brennans hailing from Wisconsin, were marking their 40th celebration of the anniversary. Außerdem, Mr. Brennan kept making jokes about how his steak was so good that he might leave his wife for the chef. We chuckled, shared travel anecdotes, and I polished off my entire plate, even sopping up the leftover butter with the complimentary bread stuff. At about midnight, I awoke to my stomach performing strange flips, similar to the feeling when you miss a step while going down the stairs, and your entire body staggers. The room was completely dark except for a thin strip of moonlight that came through the balcony door, and the ship was swaying more than normal, exacerbating the situation. I attempted to disregard it, told myself, it's possible I just overate and ate too quickly, perhaps combining too many different foods at the same time. However, at that point came this acute, twisting pain just beneath my ribs, as if someone were wringing out my intestines like a damp towel. I managed to get to the little bathroom just in time for it all to come up. The steak, the potatoes, and the 3 mojitos I had consumed earlier at the pool bar. Everything searing my throat as it returned. The vomiting kept on happening, these brutal waves that had me clutching the toilet. My entire body trembles and enshrouded in cold sweat. In the intervals of the episodes, I observed something that caused my chest to tighten in panic. The vomit contained this. It had a dark, nearly coffee ground texture and featured red streaks that were certainly not from anything I had eaten. I attempted to call guest services using the phone beside the bed, but the line simply and so wider and so forth, without response. This girl named Bethany is my cruise roommate from Oregon, with whom I had been paired via the solo traveler program, wasn't in her bed, likely still at the nightclub located on deck 12. I took my room key, quickly put on flip-flops, and staggered out into the corridor. With one hand, I pressed against my stomach, while the other sought support by sliding along the wall. The corridors were deserted, featuring only these interminable expanses of uniform doors and that strange cruise ship carpet with the twirling designs that intensified my queasiness. I had to stop every few steps and rest against the wall, inhaling through my nose and attempting to keep myself from vomiting once more. On the second deck, there was an infirmary, as per the map I had examined on day 1, which entailed using the elevator to descend 5 levels. As you While waiting for its arrival, I heard someone else retching behind a nearby door, followed by another sound further down. These ones, terrible retching noises reverberating in the corridor. It felt like the elevator took ages. As it finally opened, 3 people were already inside, each of them appearing as haggard as I was. Wearing a Disney cruise shirt, this man in his middle age was hunched over while holding onto the handrail. I had never seen a human face in this greenish-gray color before. A woman, possibly in her 30s, was seated in the corner on the floor, gripping a plastic ice bucket that wryer of bile. Her cheeks were marked with mascara. A teenage boy was hunched against the rear wall. His legs trembled so fiercely that his knees banged against each other. No one said whatever. We simply remained in our wretchedness while the elevator crept down, halting at each floor to collect up more ill passengers. On deck 4, we were crammed together like sardines, 12 or 13 of us. The air was laden with the odors of sweat, vomit, and fear. The old lady beside me was constantly whispering, "This is not correct." She kept repeating, "This isn't right," while gripping a rosary with her shaking hands. As the lift, when the doors on deck 2 opened, I thought I was hallucinating. The corridor that led to the infirmary was filled with people, a queue extending as far back as the crew quarters. There must have been 60 or even 70 passengers, all in different conditions of distress. Some were seated on the floor, leaning against the walls with their heads between their knees. Others were upright yet rocking, relying on the walls or their friends for stability. I met Mrs. Brennan from dinner, the kind woman from Wisconsin, vomiting into a trash bag while her husband comforted her returning. His visage was sweaty and pale. Some parents were carrying their lifeless children, a woman in pregnancy weeping while IHR Partner fachelte IHR MIT eine Kreuzfahrtbroschüre Luft zu. And close to the front of the line, a man had genuinely lost consciousness, reclining on the hideous carpet as his spouse yelled for assistance. The odor struck me as if it were a tangible power, feces, vomit, and beneath everything, this metallic odor that brought to mind the steak from dinner, causing my stomach clench once more. I positioned myself at the end of the queue, gliding down the wall until I found myself on the floor with my knees drawn to my chest. The woman beside me, who was still in her evening gown from the fancy event she had been at, said she'd have been waiting for 2 hours already. 2 hours? She mentioned that the infirmary had only 1 doctor and 2 nurses for the whole ship, and they were entirely inundated. Individuals who had gotten in were returning and stating that the doctor was providing everyone with the same medication, some standard anti-nausea medication, and returning them to their rooms. No intravenous fluids for dehydration, no actual checkup, mere tablets and a friendly gesture. The husband of the woman had gone to locate water, she instructed, as the crew had ceased responding to room service calls and the nearest operational the water fountain was located 3 decks above. Her lips were chapped and oozing blood, and when she attempted to rise to adjust her position, her legs buckled entirely, causing her to fall back onto the floor. After waiting for another hour and making little progress in the queue, I saw a crew member in a white uniform push through the throng, making for the infirmary doors. Individuals were reaching out to him, pleading for assistance, for water, for details, yet he merely maintained a lowered gaze and forged ahead. As he arrived at the doors, I heard him talking fast, into his radio, speaking in what seemed to be Filipino, and I picked up a few English words. Containment, corporate, along with media silence. The doors opened just briefly so that he could slip inside. As well as in that fleeting instant, I caught sight of the turmoil inside. Gurneys against the walls with individuals connected to intravenous drips, a nurse dashing between patients, and the physician, this fatigued Indian individual contending with a person in formal attire who was certainly not part of the medical team. The suit was gesturing with papers, indicating the ill passengers, and nodding his head vigorously. The doors shut once more, leaving us in the corridor with our pain. The line has completely stopped moving now. Mine, the risk of dehydration was escalating. I sensed it in the way my vision would fade to black at the edges. In what way my tongue was like sandpaper on the roof of my mouth. The lady wearing the evening gown had ceased to respond when individuals spoke to her, merely gazing at the ceiling with unseeing eyes. I was aware that I urgently required fluids, but when I attempted to get up and look for water, but the hallway slanted to the side and I hit the wall, my legs felt like jelly. At that moment, this crew member, a young Filipino guy who was no older than 19, knelt down next to me. He glanced around with anxiety, then shoved a half-filled water bottle into my hands, whispering in English with an accent that I must return to my room at once. Sagte das Restaurant auf Deck 7, das schicke, indem ich gegessen hatte. Although their freezer had malfunctioned 2 days prior, management forced them to serve the meat regardless. More than 300 individuals had dined there within the past 48 hours. He mentioned that corporate was bringing in their own doctors tomorrow morning, but tonight they were under strict instructions to limit treatment in order to avoid generating a paper trail that could result in lawsuits. Prior to my ability to question him anything else, his supervisor showed up, barking at him in Tagalog, and he scrambled away. However, his words kept turning in my mind as I drank the valuable water. Damaged freezer, 300 ill individuals, reducing treatment. I began to notice things I had overlooked before in my affliction. The crew members were not consuming the ship's water. All of them possessed sealed bottles from some external vendor. The security guards stationed at the hallway's end had on medical masks, which I had never seen on a cruise earlier. And most revealing of all, I noticed 2 first-class passengers, the ones who'd been at the first night at the captain's table, being escorted through a side entrance straight into the infirmary, skipping over the entire liney. Also, the woman beside me witnessed it and began to weep, not out of pain, but out of fury. Coming to the understanding that even in this nightmare, money dictated who was the first to be saved. She attempted to scream about it in order to alert the others, but the voice emerged as a faint whisper. Her throat was too damaged from hours of vomiting. At approximately 5 a.m., after spending almost 5 hours in that hallway, a change occurred. The man in the suit exited the infirmary, accompanied by 2 security officers, and they began to move through the crowd, verifying room numbers on individuals, key cards. As they reached me, the suit glanced at his tablet, made a face, and instructed the security guards to take me back to my room. I attempted to object, informed him I required medical treatment, that I could hardly remain upright, yet he merely grinned, this frigid corporate grin, and stated that the doctor had decided I was fit enough to recuperate in my cabin. I was hoisted up by the security guards, and I lacked the strength to battle them, while they carried and dragged me toward the elevator. I heard the suit talking, others doing the same, forcibly emptying the hallway. The expectant mother was weeping and pleading for assistance, yet they merely continued to relocate individuals. The man who had been lying on the floor unconscious was being placed onto a luggage cart, while his wife tripping along in the rear, and no one was even acting as if they were offering medical assistance anymore. They left me in my room and instructed me to remain there until further notice, that the room service would deliver electrolyte drinks and crackers within the hour of the day. Natürlich kam nix. My roommate Bethany was lying in her bed, her sheets drenched with sweat. She was curled up in a ball. She had also been ill and attempted to seek assistance at about 3 o'clock in the morning, but didn't even reach the infirmary, collapsing in the elevator. Another passenger had pulled her back into our room and left her inside. For the following 18 hours, we alternated in the bathroom, dividing the remainder of our bottled water, hearing the pandemonium in the corridor as an increasing number of individuals got ill. When we finally docked in Mexico, I learned later that 43 passengers had to be admitted to the hospital without delay. 7 found themselves in intensive care, and 2 elderly passengers lost their lives during that horrific night at sea. The Voyage line provided us with a 25% reduction on a future cruise as recompense. Caused us to sign documents stating we would refrain from speaking to the media, posting on social media, and filing lawsuits. The majority of individuals signed simply to disembark from that floating petri dish. Because I didn't sign anything, I can share this story with you now. Why I am designating the cruise line Royal Atlantic Ventures with the ship name Paradise Queen. which will set sail from Galveston, 15, Mars 2022. For 22 years, I battled blazes in Chicago, but despite that experience, nothing could ready me for the events of last April on the Celestial Dream. About 6 months ago, my daughter Megan had persuaded me to go on that Mediterranean cruise once I retired. Kept insisting I had earned it after all those years of service, that I needed to finally unwind and see the realm beyond the haze and wailing sounds. She had discovered this online deal 10 days ago, the Mediterranean, and essentially refused to accept no as a response. She even drove me to the airport herself to ensure that I in fact went. The vessel is enormous, one of those floating metropolises with 8 eateries, 3 swimming pools, and sufficient things to do for 2,000 passengers over a period of weeks. We had spent 4 days at sea. I had just departed from Barcelona that morning, en route to Nice, and I was beginning to enjoy myself, learning to play shuffleboard with a bunch of retirees from Michigan who welcomed me into their morning coffee club. The weather was perfect for the whole trip. The type of Mediterranean sunshine featured in travel magazines. Serene seas that hardly reminded you of you're floating on thousands of feet of water. That afternoon began like any additional. I've just had lunch at the buffet on deck 7. Salmon grilled with the fancy little potatoes they serve daily, and was going to my cabin for a quick nap before the amusement of the evening. My first indication that something was amiss came at about 3:30, when I noticed the horizon. The view through my porthole window revealed a peculiar dark purple hue, reminiscent of a fresh bruise, that was spreading across the sky. Subsequently arrived the announcement from the captain, with great calm and professionalism, informing us, "We may encounter some turbulent waters, so it is advisable for passengers to ensure that any loose belongings in their cabins are secured." I recall considering it strange that the crew members I encountered in the hallway were exhibiting such a hurried competence. Not exactly jogging, but for sure not sauntering. Their faces were taut with an emotion I knew from my days as a firefighter. It is the managed worry of experts who are aware of information that the general public has not yet grasped. In the span of 20 minutes, the ship began to move in a slow, unnatural manner that caused my coffee mug to slide across the desk in my cabin. I stepped out onto the balcony, and what I witnessed triggered every instinct from 2 decades of emergency response are activated. Waves resembling moving structures, white foam splashing up above our deck, and the violet sky had morphed into something biblical. Clouds as dark as night, and they were so low that you could have nearly reached out for them. Other travelers were still moving about, with some snapping pictures, entirely unaware of what lay ahead. However, I began to collect my essential items, passport, wallet, medications, and store them in a waterproof bag. I always carry old job habits with me when I travel. I attempted to call Megan, but the satellite connection was already becoming unreliable. Was able to shoot her a quick text saying we encountered bad weather, but all was well. Did not want to make her worried. At 4 o'clock, they had shut down all the outdoor decks, and the captain returned. On this occasion, his voice had lost its casual tone, telling that everyone goes back to their cabins at once and awaits additional instructions. However, I couldn't remain in my cabin given what I was witnessing through that porthole. Wellen, Didas. The complete vista vanishes, revealing only furious gray water all around. I navigated my way to deck 5 where the primary dining area was located, determining that if things turned sour, I preferred to be in a place with several exits, not stuck in a metal container 7 stories underground. The dining hall was an enormous area featuring floor-to-ceiling windows. Crystal chandeliers must have adorned the place, and there was easily seating for 500 people. And correctly now, it accommodated around 30 bewildered passengers who were seated at tables attempting to have dinner, even as plates moved about due to the staff's efforts to calm them. At that moment, the first major wave struck. Not only not rough seas anymore, but rather something that caused the whole vessel to tilt sharply to the side, so much so that a grand piano on the stage liberated itself from its bindings and glided over the floor as though it was weightless, colliding with the wall with a sound I will always remember. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. Tableau Gaudret, glass lay smashed all over the place, and people were sent sprawling across the floor amid a jumble of food, broken crockery and furniture that had turned into lethal projectiles. Near me, an old woman was tossed from her chair and slid 15 feet before colliding with a post. Her husband was crawling after her as the ship tilted at an impossible angle. The emergency alarm began to sound. This shrill electronic wail that intermingled with human screams and the sound of everything that wasn't secured crashed from one end of the room to the other. I succeeded in seizing a support column, assisted in pulling a young couple behind it just as another wave struck from the other direction. On Dai's time, I heard a structural element give way, a profound, bone-deep groan of metal. The lights flickered and switched to emergency power, bathing everything in a sickly yellow glow, and via the windows there was nothing but water in sight. Not the sky and horizon as usual, just impenetrable walls of black water surged by as if we were submerged. A crew member, this kid from the Philippines who must have been younger than 25, stumbled through the chaos with blood running down his forehead, screaming for everyone to don life jackets, gesturing toward an emergency station close to the entrance. 50% of the passengers were unable to even get to your feet, with the ship rolling as it was. And I looked on in horror as another huge wave appeared through the window, appeared to hesitate at the glass for an instant before breaking through, sending icy seawater inundating the surface of the dining hall. Currently, individuals were gliding in the water, tables were floating, and I heard someone shout that water was rising from the lower decks through the stairwells. The vessel would lean to such an extent that it was as if you were standing against the wall, only to crash back in the opposite direction. As well as, whenever it occurred, sounds of breaking could be heard from deep within the ship. Costly items, significant matters, perhaps essential matters. I succeeded in getting to the life jacket station, began tossing the orange vests to anyone within my reach as I attempted to maintain my balance on the floor that had turned into a current of salt water combined with shattered glass and refuse. There was a family from someplace in the Midwestern United States, parents of 2 adolescents. They all 4 came together closely in the back of a table that was turned upside down. The father's arm was bent at an angle that did not look natural, the mother pressing a cloth napkin to a cut on her daughter's leg. I assisted them in putting on their life jackets, demonstrated them to tighten the straps, and just then, the captain's voice came over the loudspeakers once more. Other than this time, he was yelling the phrases nobody wants to hear on a ship. This is not an odd drill. All passengers and crew to muster stations without delay. Repeat, this is not a drill. His manner of speaking revealed an underlying fear beneath the training, and that frightened me more than the waves or the tipping, or even the water gushing in. We attempted to advance together toward the muster station, but another wave struck. And all of a sudden, the lights went out entirely for around 10 seconds that seemed like an eternity. Just total blackness, with unseen water cutting around your legs and individuals shrieking from all sides. In the event of the emergency, when the lights came back on, I noticed that the water in the dining hall had reached waist level and was increasing rapidly. And via what was left of the windows, these waves that had to be 40 or perhaps 50 feet high, only water mountains, with white summits that would raise the whole vessel like a plaything before plunging it into the following one veil. Ein alterer Mann neben mir hatte einen Panikanfall. Unable to breathe. He kept insisting that his wife was still in their cabin on deck 3, and I had to physically restrain him from attempting to go down. There, as we could all hear it now, the noise of water hurrying through the ship's lower sections, doors slamming both open and closed, the profound groaning of a gigantic edifice being forced past its intended limits. Obtaining to the muster station turned into a scene reminiscent of a nightmare, where you want to run but can't accelerate sufficient. When the ship tilted, we were essentially climbing along the walls, and when it righted itself, we slid back down, the whole time struggling against water that was becoming deeper each minute. I witnessed a woman being swept away from her husband's hold, borne by the current toward the broken windows, and we 3 made a human chain to rescue her, returning, her visage a deathly hue from fright, expectorating seawater. The team members, those meant to oversee the evacuation, appeared just as frightened as the passengers. These youths, who had likely only practiced this in calm water drills, now confronted with a ship that seemed minutes away from capsizing entirely. Among them was a girl with a thick Eastern European accent who was weeping as she attempted to tally the people. IHR Klembret verwandelte sich in eine nasse Masse, während IHR Wimperntusche über die Cheeks, as she continually recited the evacuation protocols like a prayer. When we arrived at the muster station on Deck 4, the situation had escalated from perilous to catastrophic. The area around the lifeboats was in disarray, as crew members attempted to lower boats while the ship pitched so violently that the boats would extend out over the water, only to smash back into the ship's side. I observed the crushing of a lifeboat, like an aluminum can striking the hull, obliterated in mere seconds, and understood with this chilling certainty that we might not have sufficient operational boats remaining, even if we were able to deploy them. Individuals were battling to approach the remaining boats, families being torn apart, and I witnessed a man shove an older woman to move forward. The outward show of culture vanishing as quickly as our prospects for survival. The wind was shrieking with such intensity that one had to yell in order to be heard. Rain is coming in sideways like bullets, and alle paar Sekunden another wave would surge over the deck, carrying away those who weren't gripping anything and directing them toward the railings, or something even worse. At that moment, I heard it, the noise that caused even the crew members to cease their activities. This enormous metal scream from somewhere beneath, along with a tremor that coursed through the whole vessel as it had received a blow from God himself. Suddenly, the surface under us slanted beyond 45 degrees and remained in that position. Individuals gliding down the deck in a jumble of bodies and life vests, some plunging straight over the rail into the dark, roiling sea underneath. While my feet were, I succeeded in grasping a support pole with my arms and clinging to it, suspended aloft, observing with utter horror the rain-slicked horizon appearing to spin. The vessel starting what seemed like a slow-motion roll that would turn us over entirely. Water was flooding in from all directions. Now, not only waves, but also from within the ship itself. Geysers erupting through drain covers flowing down the stairs, and I could hear the engines making noises they should never create. Sounds like dying animals trapped in the engine room. That lasted a lifetime for 30 seconds. Us were suspended there on the verge of overturning. 2,000 individuals were holding their breath, dozen languages, prayers blending with the tempest's bellow, anticipating whether we'd finish that roll into the Mediterranean. Then, against all odds, the ship began to right itself, pushing against the tempest with all that remained of its stabilizers and the captain's frantic maneuvering. The deck was gradually returning to a horizontal position, but nothing felt secure or safe. A member of the crew with the radio was shouting that the Greek Coast Guard was 8 miles away, helicopters were already airborne, and rescue ships were advancing through the tempest to our location. However, 8 miles in these seas felt like 800. In the following 3 hours in a state of pure survival, assisting hurt passengers, creating human shields to prevent individuals from getting were washed overboard, using anything at our disposal to bail out water as the ship continued on with a reduced buoyancy with every hour that passes, yet still somehow floating. As the first helicopter emerged from the rain, its search the light pierced the darkness like a deliverance, and tears began to flow from the people, giving in to relief. Although we were all aware that evacuating everyone would require dozens of trips, and the ship was continuing to take on water at a rate that exceeded the pump's capacity, the injured and elderly were evacuated first, being winched into helicopters that twirled in the breeze like leaves, and I remained until nearly the conclusion, assisting with loading individuals into baskets for rescue, ensuring that frantic travelers remained composed as water lapped at our feet on what had once been the upper deck. Everyone was evacuated from the Celestial Dream in a span of 14 hours, and I had been in as one of the final groups to depart, observing from the rescue vessel as our cruise liner, illuminated by emergency floodlights from the Greek vessels, ultimately surrendered its struggle and vanished beneath the water just after daybreak. No fatalities occurred that night, which the news dubbed a miracle, even though 43 people ended up admitted to the hospital, and hundreds more sustained injuries that went unrecorded. They flew us to Athens and put us in hotels, and cruise line representatives with rehearsed sympathy and liability waivers came around, providing recompense and complimentary future cruises that no one present would ever accept. 2 days ago, I returned home to Chicago Spader. Megan encountered me at O'Hare, her face awash with tears as she clung to me tightly, as though I would vanish if she released her grip. She had watched the news coverage, those helicopter videos of the ship tilting at impossible angles, with passengers clinging to railings as waves swept across the decks. And she continued to express regret for urging me to go on the trip, which devastated me as it was not her fault at all. The formal inquiry attributed it to an unusual weather event, a sudden pressure drop that generated hurricane-force conditions within minutes, an occurrence that takes place perhaps once every 10 years in the Mediterranean region. However, understanding the scientific aspects of it doesn't prevent the nightmares in which I find myself back on that slanted deck, observing individuals glide toward the barriers, listening to that metallic scream signifying we were moments away from being yet another documentary on maritime disasters. I still can't bear to watch cruise ship ads, and when friends discuss their holiday plans, I simply nod and switch topics. Because how do you clarify that for 22 years you've been encountering burning buildings didn't frighten you as much as one afternoon when nature chose to remind 2,000 tourists that the ocean is indifferent to your shuffleboard plans or dinner bookings? 5 months ago, I was merely another exhausted ICU nurse, urgently requiring a respite from 12-hour shifts and the incessant beeping of monitors. After witnessing 3 patients code within 1 week at the hospital in Houston where I worked out, I finally converted my 2 years of savings into a booking for a 7-day cruise through the Eastern Caribbean. The Ocean Jewel was one of those enormous vessels featured in advertisements, 16 decks dedicated to pure escapism, with pools, eateries, and a plethora of activities that will make you forget about the existence of the real world. I recall standing at the harbor in Port Canaveral, gazing up at this floating city and reflecting that for once in my life, I will completely switch off and allow myself to breathe. The first couple of days were exactly what I required. Yoga in the morning on the upper deck, poolside afternoon margaritas, and dining at eateries where eating while standing between patient rounds was not necessary. On the third night, everything changed somewhere in the stretch of ocean between the Bahamas and our next harbor. After the captain's dinner, where I had too much wine, I went to bed early. A single one of those extravagant events where the officers are shown off and all act as if they don't already have sunburn and drained. I had a cabin on deck 7. Not anything special, but sufficiently comfortable, featuring a small balcony that allowed me to sit and observe the dark sea as it rolled past. About 2:47 a.m., I know the precise time because I had developed the nurse's habit of always looking at the time when I'm roused by something. I heard what seemed like someone sprinting down the corridor at full speed, out the door from my perspective. Then arrived the shrieking, comprising multiple voices, not just one but multiple, sounds that are terrified and primal, which cause your entire body to become tense. In the intensive care unit, one acquires the ability to distinguish among various kinds of screams. And these were not intoxicated party guests, having too a lot of fun. These individuals were truly suffering, and before I had time to think about it, my feet were on the ground, and I was putting on the jeans I had tossed over the chair. When I opened my door a little, the corridor was chaos. 3 cabins lowered, a couple in their middle age were positioned in their doorway. The woman gripping a torn nightgown against her chest as her husband had blood trickling from a wound above his eyebrow. Their cabin door was suspended, the locking mechanism wrecked as if a crowbar had been used on it and positioned at an unusual angle. Later on, I could observe at least 2 additional cabin doors ajar, and a strange chemical odor pervaded the atmosphere. Pungent and medicinal, it brought to mind the chloroform we learned about in nursing school but haven't used for decades. Against the wall, a younger woman, possibly in her early 20s, was sitting on the floor, her wrists bearing deep red lines, where it was evident that zip ties had been, and she continued to say the same thing repeatedly. They possessed master keys. they possessed master lock keys. The emergency lighting had activated, creating these severe shadows that caused everything to appear even more like a nightmare than it already did. The thing that truly made my gut churn was witnessing the crew members that replied. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 4 or 2 security officers arrived. 5 minutes. Rather than immediately calling for backup or beginning to document the scene, they started ushering people into their cabins with an air of almost aggressive insistence that all must go back to their rooms for the security of themselves. A tall guy with a Baltic accent and a name tag that read Dmitri was one of them, continued to inform us that a small disturbance had occurred and that all was managed. However, I was able to see into the cabin of Hamilton. The previous day I had encountered them at the pool bar, an Arizona couple who has retired and is celebrating their 40-year jubilee. And their whole room had been turned upside down. The safe was forced open, clothes were scattered all over the place, and Mrs. She was sitting on the bed with Hamilton's hands still tied behind her back with those white zip ties that had left deep impressions on her skin. The officer responsible for security, when he noticed me looking, he attempted to obstruct my view by positioning himself between me and their entrance, emphasizing that I had to return to my cabin at once. Despite all my instincts yelling at me to assist, I allowed they shoved me toward my room, but not before I glimpsed something that brought everything into focus. At the end of the corridor, next to the emergency exit, was a maintenance cart. One of those gray cylindrical objects that move the staff responsible for housekeeping utilize. Außer dass auf diesem einen Haufen von Dingen lag, die wie elektronische Geräte aussahen. The type of signal jammers I had observed being showcased at a hospital security conference focused on safeguarding patient data. The cart it was partially concealed with a standard cleaning tarp, but I could see the corner of what was unmistakably a commercial-grade lockpicking gun, the costly variety that can unlock most hotel card readers in a matter of seconds. At what time Dmitri saw me looking, and he actually took hold of my upper arm, but not firmly enough with enough firmness to get his message across, and escorted me back to my cabin himself. His companion, a woman of lesser height whose badge I couldn't see in the faint light, was already communicating on a radio in fast-paced Portuguese, and I clearly listened to her mention something in English about damage control before reverting. For the next hour I lay in bed, the door locked and a chair propped against the handle, as the noises from outside slowly subsided. My phone had no signal, which was typical in the middle of the ocean, but the ship's Wi-Fi mysteriously went through maintenance at the time I attempted to connect. At about 4 a.m., an announcement was made via the PA system by someone alleging to be the hotel director, clarifying that there had been an unfortunate event concerning a disturbed passenger who had been captured and detained. And Lee guaranteed to all that the circumstances were entirely managed and that counseling would be offered in the morning for all those impacted. But this is what that announcement failed to clarify: why I could hear at least 5 different cabins reporting thefts when I leaned my ear against the door, or why the couple from cabin 7043 described 3 attackers, not 1. It certainly did not clarify the reason I heard that same security officer Dmitri instructing someone on his radio to ensure the cameras in the elevator remain off until we finish cleaning up. The following morning, the main dining hall appeared eerily normal, like someone had pressed a reset button that affected the whole ship. Servers smiled while pouring coffee. The breakfast buffet sparkled beneath warming lights. The same cheerful cruise director who had been leading poolside games was making notices concerning the day's events in St. Thomas. However, at least 1/3 of the tables were vacant, and those among us, those who did arrive, continued to share these meaningful glances, as if they had gone through an experience that was off limits for discussion. Approximately, I discovered the Hamiltons in a corner booth. Frauen Tragedy donned by Hamilton despite the sun warming up the morning. She wore long sleeves, likely to conceal the marks on her wrists. As I got closer to them, Mr. Hamilton wurde sofort angespannt, doch seine Frau ergriff seine Hand und nickte mir zu, dass ich Platz nehmen solle. She moved in closely and whispered that all was lost. Passports, cash, her grandmother's wedding ring, and items totaling around $12,000, the jewelry they had brought for their anniversary. She stated that the security team had recorded their statement at 5 a.m., made air quotes with her fingers, and informed them that if they signed certain documents, they would receive compensation via insurance, and agreed not to talk about the incident with other passengers to avoid panic. At that point, things became truly intriguing. A man at the adjacent table, within earshot, spun around and said his name was Paul, a cybersecurity advisor based in Seattle. Er nahm sein Handy zur Hand und zeigte mir etwas, das IHM zuvor gelungen war, festzuhalten. The vessel's Wi-Fi failed. A crew member's Facebook post from 2 days prior, written in Tagalog but which he had rendered it as joking about easy targets and big score coming. The team member, who worked in guest services, had access to the passenger manifest and was aware of which cabins contained elderly individuals' partners journeying with valuables. Paul had also observed something that I had overlooked. That morning, 3 crew members had suddenly become ill and were confined to their quarters, including one from the team responsible for security. He had caught wind of the staff captain informing another officer that it was necessary to control this before we dock, and that the corporation would manage it within the company. Paul had attempted to contact the FBI using a satellite phone he had borrowed from another passenger, yet mysteriously all external communications were being prevented, allegedly because of technical issues. By midday, our small circle of aware, the number of passengers had increased to around 15 individuals, all exchanging observations in low voices throughout the ship. A lady named Janet from cabin 7039 disclosed that she had actually seen her cabin steward, a guy to whom she had been giving tips all week generously, at 2:30 a.m. standing in her doorway with 2 other men she did not know. As she screamed, they would run, but only after she noticed one of them carrying what appeared to be a master keycard on a lanyard marked security bypass. Another passenger, a retired police officer from Philadelphia named Frank, had completed some looking into matters independently. He found that the cameras on Deck 7 had been under maintenance for precisely the period during which the attacks took place, specifically between 2:30 and 4 a.m. He had also observed that several of the crew members who had been the most friendly and talkative during the first 2 days were suddenly absent from being located. And when he inquired about one specific room steward, he was informed that he had been moved to a different deck just that morning. The pattern was starting to be irrefutable. This was not a random crime of opportunity, but rather a coordinated operation that required inside knowledge, master keys, and the capability of controlling the ship's security systems. The turning point arrived when we got to St. Thomas afternoon. While the ship got ready to dock, Paul and I observed from the upper deck as 3 crew members were quietly led away via a service gangway, rather than the primary passenger exit. They existed dressed in non-military attire and bearing duffel bags, attempting to fit in with the dock workers, but I identified one of those. The woman who had spent the previous night with Dimitri, the one talking in Portuguese on the radio, was the one in question. Whenever as a group, we attempted to get off the boat to report to the police and local authorities. However, we were informed that because of administrative issues, passengers on Deck 7 were temporarily prohibited from disembarking. The director of the hotel personally came, were willing to clarify that this was for our safeguarding, as they engaged with appropriate channels to look into the matter. However, Janet had successfully escaped via a crew exit and reached the police station, only to hear that the cruise line had already reached out to them regarding a small theft that was being managed internally, and due to maritime law, they had no jurisdiction unless we could demonstrate that physical assault had taken place on U.S. territory. The officers appeared oddly disinterested in collecting her statement, and she caught one of them mentioning something regarding the desire to avoid disrupting tourism relations with the cruise company that contributed millions of dollars to their harbor. That evening, while we were sailing away from St. Thomas, Frank arranged an event in his suite that he referred to as a documentation party. Roughly 20 individuals among us compiled with the evidence we had gathered, including photos of damaged doors and recordings of suspicious radio chatter that certain travelers had recorded on their mobile devices, screenshots of crew members, social media updates, and written descriptions of all that we had seen. A woman named Dorothy, who served as a paralegal in Indiana, assisted everyone with writing thorough accounts including times, dates, and precise descriptions. We utilized Frank's military-grade satellite phone, concealed in a locked Pelican case, to transfer all data to a cloud server and send copies to the FBI Coast Guard, along with various news organizations. The administration of the ship must have realized what we were up to, as out of the blue there came a knock on the door, and the director of the hotel showed up with 4 security officers, among them Dmitri, asserting they had gotten a noise complaint and that it was against safety regulations to have more than 10 passengers in a single cabin. They attempted to seize our phones and cameras, claiming they required them as evidence for their internal inquiry. However, Frank held firm, pointing out that they lacked the legal authority to take personal property without a warrant, and any attempt to do so would be regarded as theft. It is ironic, given the situations. For the last 3 days of the cruise, it was essentially a standoff. They couldn't toss us off the ship without causing an even larger incident, and we couldn't compel them to properly look into their own network of criminal activity. But this is what ultimately transpired. At the time upon finally returning to Port Canaveral, 2 FBI agents and a Coast Guard investigator were waiting at the gangway method. Due to Frank's network and the proof we had sent, 17 passengers from Deck 7 submitted official complaints, and after Paul leaked the story to a tech journalist friend with a large Twitter following, the local news picked it up subsequent. The cruise line first attempted to portray it as an isolated event involving just one wayward employee, Jedok, when the FBI discovered more than $200,000 worth of stolen items in a cruise storage area and discovered that the security system had been intentionally undermined with administrator access codes. They were required to launch a comprehensive investigation. 3 months later, a federal prosecutor called me to inform me that 11 crew members were arrested, including 2 security supervisors and a guest services manager who had been operating this scam across various cruise lines for years, with a particular focus on elderly passengers who possess valuable gifts for anniversaries or retirement. The cruise line settled quietly with all the victims outside the courtroom, covering expenses far exceeding the value of what was taken, just to prevent us from engaging with additional media. Though it is clear that this ship has sailed, pun intended, since I am recounting this tale now. Immediately after we graduated from high school, my friends and I made the decision to book a cruise for our graduation trip. There existed us 5, Ethan, Claire, Jordan, Emily, and I, and we calculated a week at sea would serve perfectly to signify the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another. At that time, my life was uncomplicated. Part-time work at a supermarket, college applications looming over me, and that restless energy of desiring something larger. We had planned for the cruise to be our getaway, a final period of freedom prior to the moment responsibility caught up with us. The vessel itself seemed similar to a city that floats. Illuminated casinos, round-the-clock buffets, pools piled on various decks. During the first few days, we flitted from one activity to the next without much sleep, intoxicated by the newness of it all. However, the atmosphere changed late one night when Claire and I strolled by a staff corridor close to the lower decks. Although we weren't meant to be there, the door to a service stairwell had been left open often. It was there that we overheard 2 crew members conversing quietly. Although their accents varied, one phrase cut through clearly. The compartments of the morgue are already overstuffed. Initially, I thought I had misunderstood. I had never thought about having a morgue on a cruise ship. Claire seized my arm, gaze widened, and murmured, "Did you catch that?" We remained motionless, all ears. One of the men let out a sigh and remarked, "We need to categorize the rest as medical incidents. Kein Platz übrig." They relocated further along the corridor before we could grab more. Claire wanted to rush back upstairs right away, but I persuaded her to behave normally. We informed the others of what we had heard, and Ethan dismissed it with a laugh, saying every ship had a morgue for crises. Jordan, however, appeared disturbed and whispered, "Too full. This is nonsensical." A few nights later, the strangeness morphed into something darker. Emily engaged in a fierce dispute with a bartender, following her allegation that he had given her insufficient change. She was sober, simply obstinate and boisterous when she perceived an injustice. An overseer intervened, a man whose hair was slicked back and whose expression remained unreadable regardless of Emily's words. The battle fizzled out in the end, but not before she muttered that she'd report him to guest services. It was the final occasion we observed her. When the next day came, her bed was unoccupied, and her phone was charging by the nightstand, and all of her possessions appeared undisturbed. We immediately reported Emily as missing, but the response from the staff seemed rehearsed. The supervisor with whom she had a disagreement asserted that she had been observed exiting a lounge with new friends at midnight, despite the fact that none of us recalled her mentioning anything about meeting anyone. The ship's security assured us they would make announcements and review surveillance, but no announcement was made. At the time when pressed again, they maintained that she had to have gotten off during a port stop, which didn't make sense given that all of her belongings were still at the cabin. It seemed as though we were being mollified, rather than assisted. In the evening of that day, Ethan recommended that we divide and quietly investigate the restricted areas. Although he was partly joking, the more time we spent in that small cabin gazing at Emily's shoes by the door, which remained unscathed, the less it resembled a joke. Jordan was able to charm the cleaning lady pointed out where the crews accessed the elevators. Claire and I removed one of them, synchronizing our actions in the intervals between staff runs. As we descended further, the air became chillier, and the carpet was replaced by bare steel flooring. As the doors swung open, we were first met by the odor. It was a blend of industrial cleaner with something metallic and sour, a faint presence, yet unmistakable. We made little progress. A uniformed man came around the corner, and his eyes narrowed the instant he laid eyes on us. "Fragte, was wir Warren?" His voice was calm, but carried an edge that made it clear we weren't welcome. Claire exclaimed something regarding being disoriented. He silently guided us back up. On that elevator ride, the silence was unbearable. Did not reprimand us, did not issue threats, simply looked straight ahead as if we were invisible. Upon our return in the cabin, Ethan and Jordan waited with pale faces. They asserted that they had eavesdropped on a conversation between two crewmen by the loading bay regarding the relocation of another one prior to morning. The next day, rumors began to spread among travelers. A young woman was said by someone to have fallen overboard. Another maintained that it was a medical evacuation. Nothing of it corresponded with our knowledge. When we inquired with security again regarding Emily, they reiterated the same ambiguous statement about her, making the choice to depart. Jordan lost his cool and yelled at them, only to be threatened with confinement for disturbing order. At that moment, we all understood. Emily would not return, and whatever was occurring below deck was being meticulously concealed behind excuses that sounded official. Ethan stressed that we needed to obtain proof, even if it implied the danger of being caught again. We waited that night until the hallways were quietly. She returned toward the service elevators. Jordan had swiped a room key to the left on a cart, which unexpectedly functioned on the lower levels. We maintained our phones at the ready, flashlights off, hearts racing so intensely I could feel mine in my auricles. The air down there was not only cold, it felt oppressive, the sort of atmosphere where every sound reverberates noisily. Behind a locked door, the faint humming of machinery blended with what resembled cooling units. At the end of a narrow corridor, we came upon a metal door that was slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open just enough for us to get a glimpse inside. Drawers made of stainless steel lined the walls, and in the dim light, we caught an unmistakable glimpse of toe tags. In those few seconds, they exceeded my ability to count them. Claire emitted a gasp she couldn't suppress escaped her lips, and the door banged shut so hard that the frame shook. A shadow shifted in the steel's reflection. There had been someone inside. Without uttering a word, we rushed back to the elevator, praying that the key that was stolen still functioned. It did, but only by a small margin. The following morning, security rapped on the door of our cabin. They asserted that an incident report had been submitted regarding our trespassing in restricted sectors. We feigned ignorance, maintaining that we had spent the entire night in the casino, but the officers, our eyes were held by each of us. for a time sufficient to demonstrate that we were under observation. The other crews faded into paranoia. We were always together, evaded staff, and hardly spoke above a whisper in case there was an eavesdropper. The daily bulletins never mentioned Emily's name. It was like she had been removed. As the ship finally docked, we packed our things and walked off without glancing back. We were not contacted by anyone. No inquiry ensued. Eventually, her disappearance was regarded as a runaway case. Years later, even now, I can still hear those crew members whispering about compartments that were too full. I can still see the glow of Emily's phone screen, displaying a message that was only partially completed, one she never sent. We informed her parents everything, but in the absence of evidence, it came across as extreme paranoia. And perhaps that's what matters for the ship on. Individuals of our kind return home, frightened and without the strength to retaliate. During my college break, I booked that cruise because it was the most affordable option for seeing a bit of the world. The vessel wasn't fancy in any way. Paint was chipped in several places, and the corridors were so narrow that two people had to shuffle sideways to go past one another. But I thought it wasn't important. My cabin was compact, featuring a single bed against the wall, a desk with a loose drawer that squeaked upon opening, and a porthole offering a view of nothing but endless gray water. Es war nicht glamourös, aber für jemanden, der allein und mit knappen Mitteln reist, fühlte es sich ausreichend an. On the first day, I spent time investigating, dining from the buffet, and keeping in mind that this was meant to be a break. In the evening of the second day, after dining, I went back to my cabin and saw a small folded note resting just inside the entrance. Initially, I figured housekeeping might have left a note about towels or something minor. However, as I opened it up, the words were written by hand in unsteady capital letters. The crew was not to be trusted. That was all. No signature, no elucidation, nothing more. It's etched in my memory that I was gazing at it for a few minutes, attempting to figure out if this was just a dumb joke or if it was intended for me. The penmanship appeared hasty, as though the person who penned it was pressed for time. Initially, I didn't tell anyone about it. I inserted the note I put it in my backpack and attempted to dismiss it, but the thought lingered around me as I moved about the ship. Whenever a crew member smiled and inquired about the quality of my day, I found myself questioning whether they were aware of something I wasn't. I made an attempt to act normal, yet I found myself scanning faces, observing body language, noticing details I would typically never notice. A person at the bar who was shining glasses and didn't look up even once. A steward in the hallway who appeared to linger outside certain cabins for longer than required. It felt as though I had been drawn into a secret that I was not meant to know about. By the following morning, another note showed up beneath my door. This individual stated, "They will reject all claims. Remain silent." It rattled me more than I want to acknowledge. I finally mustered the courage to bring both notes to the purser's desk, believing that someone would regard it as serious. Rather, the woman at the counter chuckled politely and said, "Passengers sometimes imagine things at sea," and advised me not to be concerned. She glided the notes came back to me as if she didn't even want to hold on to them. As I turned to leave, I felt ashamed, as if I had been regarded as paranoid and dismissed. However, a part of me couldn't get rid of the warning. Subsequently meeting it, I attempted to persuade myself that it was merely a joke from someone. But things began to feel different around the vessel. At breakfast, I spotted a guy the first had spoken with the day before. Another state student who was traveling solo also wasn't at his usual spot. I thought he had missed his alarm, but he also wasn't there at lunchtime. At dinner time, his chair was still empty and nobody referred to him. No announcement, no casual vibes. He left the ship early. War simply gone. Am folgenden Tag ereignete sich dies erneut mit einer Frau, die ich oft gesehen hatte, poolside reading. She could always be seen in a crowd because she wore this wide-brimmed hat. All of a sudden, she was gone. Any longer. Her lounge chair remained unoccupied. IHR Handtuch nahm nie auf. I recall strolling on the deck, circling around, and anticipating to see her again. Yet she was gone just as thoroughly as the first guy. From then on, I began to focus more on those who were making the journey by themselves. Some of them just stopped coming. That evening, I went back to my cabin and discovered a third note that had been slipped under the door. The instant I lifted it, my chest constricted. This one stated, "You are not next yet. Remain vigilant." That word still sat in my mind like a bell that wouldn't cease ringing. I hardly slept, and every moment I heard footsteps outside my door, I fixed my gaze on the light shining through the gap beneath it, anticipating whether another shadow would halt there for too long. The engine's hum, which had once been a source of comfort, now resonated like an ominous signal, unending and burdensome. I attempted to report it again. This time, it was a different officer at the reception who dismissed it as my head is being messed with by seasickness. He said, almost pushing me away, "People get restless out here." I strolled off, grasping the notes tightly, experiencing feelings of fear and foolishness simultaneously. My word wouldn't convince the crew. Whom was I meant to place trust in? The vessel seemed enormous, yet all at once it was contracting around me. In every hallway and other areas, someone could be waiting. With every closed door, I'm reminded of the passengers I never encountered. Once more. On the 5th day, I ceased my attempts to persuade myself that I was just imagining things. The dining hall had a feeling of, though it felt more empty, despite the fact that no one else appeared to recognize it. Families chuckled. Couples took pictures, and the crew continued to smile as if nothing out of the ordinary was occurring. I continued to look for recognizable solo travelers but found no one. The absence felt overwhelming. The meals I prepared for myself became mechanical. I hardly sampled the food, as I was too concentrated on counting who was still present. Later that night, I saw 2 crew members assisting a young man I had noticed was traveling alone in the direction of a stairwell located at the corridor's end. Although he didn't appear to be intoxicated, his steps were faltering, as if he were unwilling to comply. As he looked back, his expression bore something I will always remember, as if he wished to cry out, though he was aware it wouldn't make a difference. Before I had the chance to respond, the crew guided him around the corner and out of view. It was the moment I realized the notes were more than mere warnings. They were factual. I spent the remainder of that night locked in my cabin, using the desk and even the chair to barricade the door. Each creak in the hallway caused me to hold my breath. Although no new note appeared, that nearly made it deteriorated. The silence bore down more heavily than the scrawled threats had ever done. I was awake until sunrise was only faintly visible through the porthole, which made the sea appear pale blue. 2 Tage später legte das Schiff an und ich ging von Bord, armed only with my backpack, scarcely pausing for breath until I found myself back on solid ground. Even now, I don't know what became of those passengers who are missing. No documented report, no news articles, nothing I was able to locate later. It's as if they were wiped out. The 3 notes are still tucked inside a notebook I have in the house. The handwriting is uneven and smudged due to my fingers gripping it too tightly. At times, I ponder why whoever decided to alert me in any way. Perhaps it was just luck. Or perhaps I was just one step away from becoming the next name it was never mentioned again. Music I registered for that cruise since it was the most affordable option for my friends and me might find. To be honest, it felt like the kind of impulsive trip that college kids are supposed to go on. We were not pursuing luxury, merely an opportunity to be on the water, sharing a small cabin, dividing expenses, and acting like we were grown-ups on holiday. Als wir, erinnere ich mich, dass das Schiff alter aussah, als gedacht, embarked. The paint was dull. The metal railings were already showing rust patches, but we laughed it off. At this point, the only thing I could think about was how surreal it felt to be out at sea with my friends, away from assignments and noise on campus. The first couple of days passed without incident, only sunshine and crowded buffets, and uncomfortable chats with people you don't know at communal tables. I dedicated most of that time with my trip roommate Leah, who was full of restless energy and constantly dashing off to discover various decks, perpetually pulling me along to check the view from up here or what's occurring down there. She kept mentioning that it felt like something was brewing, noting how the sky never seemed totally evident, even while all the others were lounging in the sun. I dismissed it, presuming she was merely overthinking. We were young and believed that nothing serious could affect us in the outside world. On the third night, everything changed. As dinner was just finishing up, a voice came over the speakers with an announcement, breaking through the typical banter. Though the captain's voice was even, it was also clipped, indicating that a storm had taken a surprising twist. It was not meant to be close to our route, but now it was coming directly toward us. Initially, people laughed nervously, but when the crew began distributing instructions with tense expressions, the tension quickly spread. Leah shot me a pointed glance, as if she had known the truth from the beginning, and for the first time, I sensed that the atmosphere inside the ship was becoming heavy with fear. By the stroke of midnight, the vessel was no longer sliding. It was creaking. With every swell, it felt as if a gigantic hand were thrusting the whole vessel on its side. Flure neigten sich, Teller zerbrachen irgendwo unter uns, und jeder wall appeared to shake in objection. The lights went on and off intermittently, until they ultimately ceased entirely. Picture hundreds of travelers groping about in pitch blackness, the noise of water careening where it ought not to be, and the metal encircling you straining with each wave. I gripped the railing outside our cabin door so tightly that my knuckles turned numb, assured that the next crash would cleave the ship asunder. Leah and I attempted to head toward the stairwell, but the floor slanted so fiercely that we crashed into the wall on multiple occasions. In the darkness, individuals were yelling, their voices reverberating through the cramped passageways. Some were calling for relatives, while others simply screaming at every jolt. A crew member with a flashlight passed by us, barking guidelines that were submerged due to the impact of water colliding with the ship's body. For a brief time, I could scent the cedar prior to my experiencing it, frigid, coursing beneath the cabin doors, disseminating rapidly through the carpeted corridor. At last, we arrived at a railing close to one of the primary decks, gripping it alongside scores of people I didn't know, yet they all had the same look of unfiltered terror. The ship leaned to such a degree that the external horizon appeared in a vertical orientation, a water wall rising to an elevation greater than anything I had imagined. The force of the blow caused the metal beneath us to let out a scream, as if the ship were lamenting. I recall holding onto Leah's arm so tight that she yelped, yet neither of us had the courage to release our grip. It seemed as though the only thing that connected us to reality was that guardrail. The blackout persisted, interrupted solely by the faint illumination of emergency lights that sputtered occasionally, but not enough for clarity. At a deeper level, alarms let out uneven bursts of wailing, then stopped suddenly. I continued to reflect on how niemand hatte uns darauf vorbereitet. Cruises included safety drills, of course, but nothing about standing in darkness while waves flung the vessel about like a plaything. Every second felt as if it could be the last, before something broke, before we were all devoured completely. In that chaos, hours merged into one another. Time stood still usually. With every groan of the ship's frame, it stretched and warped. At a certain point, Leah murmured, "We won't survive this," and I was unable to bring myself to debate. I simply pushed my forehead onto the cold metal railing and heard the water crash and to withdraw, slamming and receding repeatedly, like a countdown to something definitive. I reflected on my parents, on the absurd choice to cut costs for this journey, on how nobody on land even was aware of our experience at that precise moment. Once the storm finally let up, the calm was not gradual. It had been as if the ocean had suddenly let out a breath. The shudders, which had been violent, turned into dull tremors. The crashing morphed into a disquieting lapping, and for the first time in hours, there was silence distributed over the decks. Emergency lights flashed back to life, exposing drenched clothes and ashen faces. Individuals held on to one another like shipwreck survivors, despite the fact that we were still technically afloat. I recall letting go of the railing and being astonished that my arm still functioned, with every muscle rigid from clinging on. The team ultimately led us toward the interior again, although the majority of the corridors were filled with water up to our ankles. Cabin doors hung askew on their frames, and possessions drifted by like flotsam in a deluged cellar. Leah and I tripped into our room to discover our beds turned over and ceiling tiles drooping due to leaks. The air had a salty scent. and diesel sharp and weighty clinging to my lungs with every breath. I doubt I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up straight, anticipating that the ship would start shaking again. The following morning, we found out that the storm had shifted direction so abruptly that the captain had to endure it. A few is labeled as a hero by some and as reckless by others. But I didn't care about any of that. The important thing was that the ship had barely held together, and I had stared at the ocean in its most violent form and lived to tell the tale. I recall observing the dawn from the deck, the horizon tranquil and gilded, as though the previous nightmare had been a hallucination. However, the twisted metal railings and broken windows were evidence that it had occurred. Even after years later on, I still feel the effects of that night whenever I hear strong winds outside my apartment or when I walk by a building. Making a creaking sound during inclement weather, it's more than just the memory of fear. It's the helplessness, the awareness that you are subject to powers much greater than you. That journey was meant to be inexpensive and without worries. Simply another tale from university. Rather, it left me with a recollection I can't get rid of grasping onto frigid metal in the shadows, anticipating the sea's verdict on my fate.